The ninja didn't disappear because they were defeated in battle. They disappeared because Japan decided they were too dangerous to exist. This is not the story of a war. It's the story of an extermination. If you enjoy history without myths and romanticism, subscribe to Fragments of History, leave a like, and comment where you're watching from. By the late 16th century, Japan's warlords faced a problem that armies, castles, and superior tactics could not solve. It was a problem of control, or more precisely, the absence of it. And at the center of that problem were the ninja. They were not a vast army. Their communities counted in the thousands, not the tens of thousands. They did not possess the visible weight of domains, fortresses, or standing formations. Their threat was more fundamental than numbers. They represented power that existed outside the system. And in an age moving towards centralization, that alone made them intolerable. Feudal power was designed to be seen. A daimyo ruled through force that could be counted, displayed, and measured. Armies marched under banners that declared allegiance. Castles projected authority through stone and height. The social order was legible. You could trace command, obligation, and status like lines on a map. Ninja networks refused that map. They had no castles to take, no banners to follow, no single lord whose death would collapse the whole. Their strength came from decentralization, independent communities, loose affiliations, knowledge passed through families and local ties rather than formal institutions. You could not conquer what had no center. There was no headquarters to burn, no court to negotiate with, no throne to topple. That structure made them useful as tools and impossible as an institution. A warlord could hire ninja for a specific operation. He could pay for sabotage, infiltration, intelligence, but he could not demand loyalty the way he demanded it from samurai vassals. The bond was not feudal, it was transactional. When the job ended, the obligation ended with it. And that was the poison in the relationship. The same hands that served you could serve your rival, not because of betrayal or dishonor, but because the system itself did not bind them. Work could shift with payment, pressure, or survival. A ninja network could be your advantage this month and your vulnerability the next. The information they carried was even harder to contain. Espionage in a centralized world is meant to flow through channels that can be watched, taxed, punished, and sealed. Ninja intelligence did not move that way. It traveled through informal connections, family links, village relationships, merchant routes that crossed domain boundaries without permission or ceremony. A lord could sense that his plans had leaked, yet never find the mouth that spoke or the ear that listened. In that climate, information became a weapon that did not answer to rank. A state in formation depends on controlling what people know, what is true, what is permitted, what is whispered, and what is denied. Independent intelligence networks made that control unstable. Ninja could reveal secrets meant to stay hidden. They could spread knowledge that undermined official narratives, or they could do something just as corrosive, create uncertainty about what had been seen, what had been heard, and who now held power over whom. Regional autonomy turned this into a territorial threat. In places like Iga and Kōga, ninja communities had maintained semi-independent status for generations. They paid minimal tribute when they had to and governed themselves when they could. In a fragmented Japan, that was tolerable, sometimes even useful. Weak central authority often survived by leaving strong local realities untouched. But as warlords began to imagine unified domains under their absolute control, untouched became unacceptable. The autonomy of these communities wasn't only political, it was operational. They trained their own, they developed their own methods. They maintained their own networks, made their own decisions, accepted or refused contracts based on internal judgment. No outside authority approved their activities, regulated their techniques, or controlled the spread of their knowledge. In effect, they were private intelligence services operating beyond oversight. At the very moment governments were trying to monopolize legitimate violence and the means to deploy it. For warlords, the fear was not paranoia. It was calculation. Every lord who employed ninja understood that the same capabilities could be turned on him. The infiltrators who gathered intelligence for you today could gather intelligence about you tomorrow. The operatives who removed your enemies could remove you if someone paid more, threatened harder, or simply moved faster than you did. And this fear did not stay contained within one domain. It multiplied across Japan. If your rival had ninja networks and you did not, you were exposed. If you both had them, you entered a constant covert conflict where certainty collapsed. No one could be sure what the other truly knew. Plans could fail without visible cause. Alliances could break without explanation. Victories could appear like accidents. Defeats could arrive like rumors made real. The strategic landscape became unreadable because the work happened invisibly, and its effects often left no trace that could be officially named. That invisibility was not just a battlefield problem. It was a deeper threat to the logic of feudal authority itself. Feudal power depended on being seen. A lord's rule was legitimate because everyone could witness it. The castle on the hill, the army in formation, the ceremonies of submission. Visibility was proof. It told the population where power lived and warned them what happened when they challenged it. Ninja power was designed to erase that proof. It worked best when no one knew it had worked at all. When the gate was opened without a witness, when the message vanished, when the fire started in the wrong place at the wrong time, when the cause could never be pinned down and the fear could therefore spread anywhere. That made ninja ungovernable through conventional means. You could not intimidate communities that held no obvious assets to seize. You could not defeat networks that offered no armies to engage. You could not negotiate with organizations that had no official representatives, and you could not absorb them into hierarchy without destroying what made them effective, because their strength came from staying outside the very structures the new state demanded. By the 1570s, as men like Oda Nobunaga consolidated territory and began to imagine a Japan ruled by centralized force, one conclusion became unavoidable. Ninja communities could not be reformed into the emerging order. They could not be regulated without breaking them. They could not be incorporated without neutralizing them. Their nature, decentralized, autonomous, invisible, made them incompatible with the state being built. So the solution was not reform, it was removal, not defeat in open battle, because they could not be met on those terms, not disbandment by negotiation, because there was no single authority to bargain with, but systematic destruction. Communities scattered, knowledge suppressed, members killed or absorbed into institutions where their skills could be watched, directed, and controlled. The decision was never announced. It was never declared as policy. It would not be carved into proclamations or celebrated in ceremony. But across Japan's consolidating domains, warlords reached the same quiet understanding. The ninja had become too dangerous to be allowed to survive. And once that understanding settled into place, what followed was not a war. It was an extermination, planned in silence, carried out without mercy, and justified by a single need: control. But deciding that the ninja must be erased was only the first step. The next question was how to erase something designed to disappear. And as Japan began to centralize, the state found its answer. For over a century, Japan had existed in a state of fragmentation historians call the Sengoku period, the age of warring states. Dozens of daimyo ruled their own domains, forming and breaking alliances, launching campaigns that settled nothing for long. Power was distributed, authority was local. No single force could impose order on the chaos. That fragmentation was the world the ninja needed. With no central authority to regulate covert work, with competing lords hungry for intelligence, with borders shifting and loyalty negotiable, ninja networks found endless openings. They moved between domains, served multiple clients, and lived in the gaps of a fractured political landscape where control was always partial and secrecy could survive. But by the 1560s, a different kind of warlord was rising. Men like Oda Nobunaga were not satisfied with a province or a local victory. They envisioned something Japan had rarely known: unified rule under absolute control, where authority flowed from one source, where local autonomy was cut away, where power meant more than winning wars. It meant administering territory and population so thoroughly that resistance became difficult to organize. To build that kind of rule, swords were not enough. Traditional warfare, armies colliding, castles besieged, defeated lords submitting, could conquer land. It could not create the deeper control these warlords wanted. That required systems, information, administration, surveillance, and the removal of any power that operated outside official command. Nobunaga pursued this with brutal clarity. When he conquered a region, he did not stop at battlefield victory. He changed how power functioned. Local officials were replaced with administrators loyal to him. Taxation was standardized. Communication was routed through channels he could manage. Autonomous institutions that might resist central authority were eliminated. He was building not only an army, but an apparatus, something closer to a state. And a state does not merely fight enemies. It watches its own territory. Surveillance became policy, not a tool reserved for wartime. Traditional espionage tracked troop movements and supply lines. The new surveillance monitored everything that could become a threat: tax compliance, political loyalty, religious activity, merchant routes, informal networks, the flow of information itself. The goal was not just to defeat rivals, but to know what was happening inside lands already under your rule, and to shape it. At the same time, warfare was being standardized. Nobunaga's forces refined coordinated firearms use, disciplined formations, and logistics that supported sustained campaigns. Battles became more organized, more predictable, more replicable. Individual prowess mattered less than mass discipline. Efficiency replaced chaos. In that emerging system, ninja were an anomaly. Their warfare could not be standardized. Their intelligence could not be fully institutionalized. Their structure resisted hierarchy by design. You could write doctrine for muskets. You could drill formations. But you could not mass-produce what ninja networks relied on: specialized skills, localized knowledge, personal trust, community ties built over generations. Their methods did not scale cleanly into an official chain of command, and once you forced them into one, they stopped being what you hired them to be. Worse still, ninja capabilities threatened the surveillance state itself. If your power depends on knowing what happens inside your domain, then an intelligence network you do not control is intolerable. Ninja could study your informants, identify your channels, learn how your security works, compromise it. They represented counterintelligence in an era when counterintelligence was not yet fully formed, an invisible force that could see you while remaining unseen. The warlords driving centralization understood that controlling territory meant controlling information. Official messengers carried sanctioned communications. Registered merchants handled approved trade. Licensed travelers moved with documentation. The state was beginning to make movement legible. Ninja were the opposite of legible. They moved outside those systems. They communicated through channels that never appeared in records. They gathered intelligence that never entered official reports. Even when they were not actively opposing a lord, their existence created uncertainty. You could not be confident what was secure because they might have accessed it. You could not trust your defenses because circumventing defenses was the point. You could not rely on your intelligence advantage because they might already be feeding your rivals. The birth of a strong state required monopolies on violence, on information, on legitimacy. Private armies could not be tolerated, so samurai were absorbed into daimyo forces or removed. Alternative sources of authority could not stand unchallenged, so autonomous religious institutions were brought under control or destroyed, and independent intelligence networks could not be permitted, which meant ninja communities had to be neutralized. This decision was not made in a single dramatic moment. It was not announced in proclamations. It emerged as the cold logic of centralization. A lord building a unified domain could use ninja skills until the day he realized the people who held those skills were ungovernable. Some tried compromise. They hired ninja while attempting to prevent them from working for rivals. They offered permanent positions to individuals, hoping to convert them into state agents. They negotiated with villages, seeking to bring them under domain authority while preserving what made them valuable. These compromises failed because they misunderstood what ninja communities were. They were not military units waiting to be hired and commanded. They were social networks, rooted in family ties, local knowledge, mutual obligation, existing outside and before any arrangement with a lord. You could hire a samurai because a samurai's identity was tied to service. Ninja identity was tied to community, and community does not surrender neatly into paperwork, so the problem became larger than operatives. The communities themselves had to be broken, not reformed, not slowly absorbed, but destroyed as autonomous entities. That meant targeting villages that produced operatives, family networks that sustained them, and the local knowledge that made them effective. It meant warfare not against armies, but against populations, where the objective was not defeating combatants, but erasing the conditions that allowed a covert society to exist. By the late 1570s, Oda Nobunaga had concluded that Iga and Kōga, the heartlands of ninja culture, posed an unacceptable threat to his consolidation of central Japan. His experience with covert operations had taught him how vulnerable even strong domains were to infiltration and sabotage. His vision of unified control left no room for autonomous regions practicing ungovernable forms of warfare. The decision was made quietly in private councils without official documentation. There would be no declaration of war, no formal accusations, no opportunity for surrender. The ninja regions would simply be invaded, populations scattered or killed, communities dismantled so completely they could never reform. What was about to unfold was not a campaign in any traditional sense. It was extermination. And once the machinery of the new state turned toward Iga and Kōga, the shadows would not protect anyone living there. Iga and Kōga weren't merely places where ninja happened to live. They were symbols of everything centralized authority found intolerable. Autonomous regions that had resisted external control for generations, communities practicing warfare the state could not regulate, populations whose deepest loyalty ran inward to one another, not outward to distant lords. Even the land itself felt like an act of refusal. Both provinces sat in mountainous terrain in central Japan, between major domains, yet fully owned by none. The mountains raised natural barriers against conventional armies. Narrow valleys funneled invaders into routes that could be predicted, watched, and punished. Forests provided cover for defenders who knew every trail, every stream, every concealed approach. The terrain favored small, mobile forces over massed formations, exactly the kind of conflict ninja had been built for. That isolation preserved autonomy for centuries. While surrounding regions fell under the rule of expanding daimyo, Iga and Kōga maintained a semi-independent existence. They paid nominal tribute when necessary, usually to whoever seemed strongest at the moment, but governed their internal affairs without sustained outside interference. No daimyo had ever imposed direct administration here, not because the regions were worthless, but because the cost of control exceeded what conquest could reasonably deliver, and the communities inside them did not resemble the feudal order outside. There was no single lord enthroned in a dominant castle, no clean hierarchy of vassals and retainers, no administrative structure that an outsider could negotiate with, buy off, or decapitate. Power was distributed across family networks, Momochi, Fujibayashi, Hattori in Iga, and similar confederations in Koga, families that made decisions collectively through councils instead of obeying one man's command. That structure was more than political. It was protective. It made the regions difficult to take because there was no obvious point where taking could begin. These families had been training in covert warfare for generations. It wasn't a profession you entered from the outside. It was an identity inherited, taught from childhood, embedded into the rhythm of daily life. People learned infiltration alongside farming. They gathered information while conducting legitimate trade. Techniques moved through households as quietly as recipes. Knowledge kept close, passed down without paperwork, without record, from the perspective of a centralizing state that made the entire population potentially dangerous. The threat was not that some people were ninja. It was that ninja capability was diffused through the community. A farmer might also be an infiltrator. A merchant might also be an intelligence gatherer. A monk might also carry skills that did not belong to his robe. The categories that made society legible elsewhere, warrior, peasant, priest, blurred here, sometimes vanished entirely, and history made the symbolism sharper. Iga and Kōga had repelled multiple attempts at conquest over the previous century. When powerful lords tried to impose control, the communities used terrain and covert pressure to make occupation unsustainable. Garrisons found supply lines cut, communications broke down, officers disappeared. The occupiers eventually withdrew, leaving behind the quiet confirmation that these provinces were effectively ungovernable by conventional means. That precedent was dangerous. If Iga and Kōga could remain autonomous while the rest of Japan was being absorbed into larger domains, what did that say about the inevitability of central rule? If mountain communities could resist the most ambitious warlords in the country, what stopped other regions from imagining they could do the same? Their existence undermined the story Nobunaga and others needed people to believe, that consolidation was unstoppable, that resistance was futile, that the future had only one direction. Strategically, the threat ran deeper than symbolism. Positioned in central Japan, Iga and Kōga sat near routes that connected major domains. Intelligence gathered there could be sold outward in any direction. Operatives trained there could be deployed anywhere nearby. The provinces functioned as a kind of neutral ground where lords, who were officially enemies, could both access ninja services, an arrangement that turned rivalry into unintended funding for the same hidden networks. In an age moving toward total war and absolute loyalty, that neutrality became a provocation. Nobunaga's vision of a unified Japan had no space for regions that served everyone and therefore served no one. You were either inside the system being constructed or you were an obstacle to it. And Iga and Kōga, stubborn, autonomous, unreadable, were obstacles. The targeting did not begin with invasion. It began with marking. Nobunaga's forces secured surrounding regions first, absorbing or conquering domains adjacent to the ninja provinces until the borders of Iga and Kōga touched only territory under unified authority. Roads were improved, garrisons placed, administrative systems extended to the edges. The message was never stated, but it was obvious. These autonomous pockets were being sealed inside a tightening frame. Economic pressure followed. Trade routes that had passed through Iga and Kōga were redirected. Merchants doing business in the mountain provinces faced increased scrutiny and taxation when traveling through Nobunaga's lands. The informal economy that sustained these communities, intelligence sales, covert services, facilitation of communications between rival domains, was disrupted deliberately, piece by piece, until survival became harder and movement became riskier. Diplomatic isolation came next, and it was no less methodical. Lords who maintained relationships with Iga and Kōga families began receiving pointed messages about the inadvisability of those contacts. Some were offered incentives to sever ties, trade advantages, military support, political recognition. Others received warnings dressed as questions, investigations into loyalty, hints that harboring spies would invite consequences, suggestions that their own domains might be examined next. Inside the ninja provinces, the pattern was unmistakable. They had generations of experience reading political weather. They understood encirclement when they saw it. They were being isolated, labeled, prepared for removal. Some families argued for preemptive action, strike before the invasion, destabilize Nobunaga from within, prove that attacking them would be catastrophically expensive. Others argued for accommodation. Perhaps exclusivity could buy survival. Perhaps, if they offered their services to Nobunaga alone, pledging not to work for his enemies, they could negotiate a place inside the new order. Maybe autonomy could be traded for security. Maybe independence could be surrendered to preserve the communities themselves. But the deeper strategic thinkers understood what neither side wanted to say out loud. Resistance would not stop the logic driving this. Accommodation would not satisfy it. Nobunaga was not trying to conquer them in the old sense. He was trying to eliminate them as autonomous entities. He did not want ninja communities that served him exclusively. He wanted their knowledge and techniques controlled by his apparatus, practiced by agents he could command, folded into systems he could monitor. That meant the independent communities had to be broken, because as long as they remained intact, the threat remained intact. The siege was inevitable, not because conflict was unavoidable, but because centralization demanded it. A state claiming total authority cannot tolerate regions that answer to no one. A power structure built on monopolizing violence cannot accept communities practicing ungoverned warfare. A system built on legibility and control cannot incorporate populations whose effectiveness depends on invisibility and autonomy. By 1579, the encirclement was complete. Iga and Kōga were surrounded, economically pressured, and diplomatically abandoned, isolated pockets in a sea of centralized power. What remained was the execution, and Oda Nobunaga had already decided exactly how it would proceed. The invasion did not come like a raid. It came like weather, slow at first, then everywhere at once. Columns of regular troops moved in coordinated lines, not the scattered bands Iga had learned to bleed and mislead. This was not a lord testing the mountain borders. This was a state's hand closing into a fist. Iga had survived because it was difficult to reach, costly to hold, and nearly impossible to read. That advantage depended on scale. Against small forces, the mountains were a labyrinth. Against an army that could afford to lose men, burn time, and keep advancing anyway, the labyrinth became a trap. The entrances were taken, passes that once belonged to silence, filled with marching boots and shouted orders. The valleys that used to funnel invaders into ambush now funneled entire units into positions that had been mapped, measured, and occupied. The forest, once cover, became a boundary that could be set on fire. And as the army moved inward, the nature of the war changed. Iga had never been only fighters. It was villages, families, routes of communication, and small agreements that held the region together. The networks that made covert warfare possible were not separate from daily life. They were woven into it. That meant the invasion could not be fought only at the edge. It had to be fought everywhere at once by people who were also trying to protect children, elders, food stores, and homes. In open field battle, Iga could not match a disciplined army. So resistance came as it always had: disruption, misdirection, sabotage, and sudden violence from places that looked empty. But the invaders did not come expecting a clean fight. They came to erase the conditions that made resistance possible. Regular soldiers pushed into settlements with orders that did not distinguish between a trained operative and the village that had raised one. Homes were searched, storehouses emptied, and anyone suspected of aiding the networks was treated as part of the networks. The line between combatant and civilian, already blurred by the nature of Iga's society, was used against the region itself. Villas and hamlets were put to the torch, not as collateral damage, but as method. Fire did what swords could not. It destroyed hiding places. It forced people into the open. It burned food, tools, records, and the quiet infrastructure of survival. It made the mountains glow at night, turning secrecy into smoke and ash. A place built on invisibility was being dragged into visibility by flame. The killings were not chaotic. They did not need to be. When an army enters a village with total control, it can turn death into procedure. People were gathered, questioned, separated, judged quickly, executed quickly. Sometimes there was no questioning at all, only the assumption that if a community existed in Iga, it existed for the same purpose. This was not a battle to win territory. It was an operation to empty a region of its identity. Iga fought anyway. Families that had trained for generations did what they knew how to do. They vanished, reappeared, and struck where discipline was weakest. They cut supply lines, ambushed isolated groups, disrupted communications. They used the terrain's choke points. The night, the weather, the false trail, the familiar creek crossing that looked safe until it wasn't. For a moment, it worked, because it always had. But the scale was different now. The invaders had reserves. They had the ability to replace losses without slowing down. They advanced like a machine that could shed parts and still function. And they did not panic in the way earlier occupiers had. They did not withdraw when officers disappeared. They responded by tightening, reinforcing, and burning wider. Iga's resistance became desperate because the targets changed. It wasn't enough to strike soldiers. Villages needed time to evacuate, families needed safe routes, networks needed to stay intact long enough to move people and knowledge out of reach. Resistance became less about winning and more about delaying, holding the line long enough for something to survive beyond it. And that was where the mountains betrayed them. Local knowledge is power, until the enemy refuses to play by its limits. Iga knew the trails. But you cannot hide an entire population on narrow paths forever. You cannot feed thousands without stores. You cannot keep moving without leaving tracks. And once the surrounding territory was controlled, every path led to the same reality, a ring that grew tighter with each day. The invaders did not need to outsmart the mountains. They only needed to occupy them. They placed men at crossings. They built temporary fortifications where none had existed. They turned routes into checkpoints. And where knowledge was strongest, where Iga expected to dictate movement, they forced movement to stop entirely by making the landscape itself hostile. As the pressure tightened, the networks began to collapse, not because the people forgot their skills, but because the conditions that made those skills effective were being destroyed faster than they could adapt. A covert society needs safe houses, trusted messengers, stable relationships, and the ability to disappear into ordinary life. When ordinary life is burned away, there is nothing left to disappear into. Messages stopped arriving. Families that had served as hubs went silent. Villages that had stored supplies became charred ground. The informal web of obligations, who could be trusted, who could shelter whom, fractured under terror and speed. Some fled, some were captured, some were killed, and some, faced with the certainty of annihilation, made choices that would haunt survivors long after the fires went out. In the end, the victory was not earned through brilliance. It was earned through excess. More men than Iga could bleed. More fire than Iga could outlast. More pressure than a decentralized society could absorb without snapping. The mountains that had protected Iga became walls that kept the destruction inside. When the army finally slowed, it wasn't because resistance had been defeated in open combat. It was because there was less left to resist. The region was broken in the way a living thing is broken, its structures ruined, its routines shattered, its people scattered into flight, captivity, or graves that would never be marked as they deserved. And yet even then, not everything was gone. In the smoke and confusion, some escaped. Not armies, not units, individuals, fragments of families, pieces of knowledge carried in memory and fear, moving out through gaps that could not be sealed perfectly, because no system is perfect. But that survival came with a price. Because once Nobunaga proved Iga could be erased by force, the question was no longer whether other ninja regions could survive. It was whether anyone connected to them could hide. Anywhere in Japan, now that the state had learned what extermination looked like. Iga burned and Japan watched. Some called it a necessary purge. Others called it a warning. But in the shadows beyond the ruins, another region listened, silent, divided, and already being dismantled without an invasion. Oda Nobunaga was not a man who tolerated ambiguity. His approach to war and governance was built on clarity, control, and the systematic removal of anything that resisted order. He had burned Buddhist monasteries that challenged his authority. He had massacred rebellious populations to warn others. He had destroyed rival clans so thoroughly their names faded from living memory. The ninja provinces would receive no different treatment, and in one sense, worse, because Nobunaga understood their danger in ways other lords did not. His strategic genius was not limited to battlefield maneuvers. It lay in recognizing patterns others ignored. Where traditional warlords treated ninja as useful tools, sometimes inconvenient, sometimes necessary, Nobunaga saw a systemic threat. Covert warfare was not merely an alternative way to fight. It was a different kind of power, a force that could bypass walls, dissolve command, and poison a domain from within. He didn't arrive at that conclusion from theory. He arrived there from experience. During his rise, sabotage shadowed his campaigns. Supply depots burned before critical operations. Officers died from sudden illnesses at moments that destabilized entire plans. Intelligence about his movements reached enemies too quickly to be explained by ordinary spies. Even when he tightened security, more guards, altered routines, trusted retainers, his defenses were still penetrated often enough to prove a point he could not ignore. Someone was getting in. Someone was always getting in. Nobunaga hired ninja himself, like every major lord, and each time he used them, the same realization hardened. The operative who could infiltrate an enemy castle today could infiltrate yours tomorrow. The network that brought him information kept ties to other clients. The specialist who removed a threat on command carried knowledge that made him a threat by nature. The more Nobunaga relied on ninja capabilities, the more he understood that they could not be managed through normal feudal bonds. Samurai service was anchored by status, honor, family obligation, and social position, forces that bound men to a lord through more than wages. Ninja service was anchored in contract, payment, pressure, survival. Their loyalty lasted exactly as long as the agreement did, and sometimes only as long as the conditions remained favorable. Worse, their effectiveness depended on autonomy. The moment you pulled them fully into conventional command structures, you broke what made them valuable. They were useful because they were outside the normal system. That also meant they could never be fully trusted inside it. It was an impossible trap. To compete with rivals who used covert operations, you needed covert operations. But acquiring that capacity meant empowering people you could not fully control. There was only one end state that solved the contradiction: a monopoly. Absorb techniques into the state, control the practice through institutions, destroy the independent communities that sustain the knowledge. But to do that, the heartlands had to be removed first. Nobunaga's planning for Iga was meticulous in a way many of his other conquests weren't. This would not be a conventional campaign. Iga had no central castle worth besieging, no massed army to annihilate, no single command structure you could decapitate and call it victory. The region itself was the target. Every village, every family line, every person who might preserve the knowledge, the connections, the techniques. The goal was not to defeat an opponent, it was to erase a society. The force he assembled reflected that intention. Instead of a rapid strike optimized for decisive engagements, Nobunaga gathered an overwhelming army designed to saturate the province. Tens of thousands of troops, far more than Iga could ever meet directly, because the goal was not to win a battle. It was to occupy space, choke movement, and deny escape. Every valley had to be held. Every mountain path had to be blocked. Every route out had to be sealed. Timing mattered as much as numbers. Nobunaga intended to move in late 1579, but he delayed until he had secured agreements across the surrounding domains. No neighboring lord would offer refuge to fleeing families. No adjacent territory would become a base for regrouping. Iga would not face Nobunaga alone. It would face the coordinated indifference of the region, a silent tightening of borders around it. The strategy emphasized excess over elegance. Nobunaga understood exactly how Iga fought. Terrain, ambush, disruption, covert pressure that turned occupation into exhaustion. He answered by making his advantage so extreme that skill would be drowned in volume. You cannot ambush an enemy that holds every approach at once. You cannot exploit a choke point when the enemy has enough men to occupy the ridges above it. You cannot wage guerrilla war when there is no safe territory left to retreat into. Negotiation was not part of the plan. His commanders received instructions without ambiguity. No truces, no surrenders, no bargains, no offers of service in exchange for mercy. The communities were to be destroyed, not incorporated. A ninja who offered loyalty would be killed alongside those who resisted. This was not a tantrum. It was a strategic decision. Accepting surrenders would preserve what Nobunaga wanted eliminated: the networks, the kinship ties, the transmission of knowledge. A man who swore loyalty today might maintain contacts tomorrow. A family spared might train again once attention moved elsewhere. The only way to end the threat permanently was to break the community so completely they could not reform. Brutality became method. Villages would be burned not only to destroy shelter, but to eliminate equipment, records, and material culture. Populations would be scattered to prevent regrouping. Families would be separated to shatter kinship networks, the channels through which skills and identity were passed. The goal was not simply killing, it was cultural erasure, destroying the social structure that made ninja communities possible. Nobunaga's subordinates understood what was being ordered. This was not honorable warfare. Samurai trained to fight other warriors would be killing farmers, burning homes, executing families. There would be no glory in it. No heroic tales, only smoke, bodies and silence, work that served the state Nobunaga was building and stained the hands that carried it out. Some commanders expressed discomfort, not out of sympathy for the ninja, but out of fear of precedent. If autonomy itself could be punished with extermination, what stopped the same logic from being applied elsewhere? Where was the line between crushing a threat and terrorizing populations into permanent submission? Nobunaga's answer was characteristic. There was no line. Authority meant the power to destroy what threatened it. Questioning that authority made you a threat yourself. The ninja provinces would be eliminated because they could not be controlled. Any other region that insisted on similar autonomy would face the same fate. This was not cruelty in Nobunaga's mind. It was logic. A unified state tolerated no exceptions. The order of destruction was issued in September 1579. Multiple armies would invade from different directions, converging to prevent coordinated defense. The operation would continue until organized resistance ceased, and then extend into systematic clearing, village by village, valley by valley. Commanders were given permission to act with complete ruthlessness. Nothing done in Iga would be punished. The greatest military mind of his generation had turned his full attention toward communities that had survived for centuries. And the ninja, so skilled at slipping through cracks, so practiced at disappearing, were about to learn a final reality. Invisibility does not protect you when the enemy is willing to burn the entire landscape until nothing remains to hide. The invasion of Iga began in October 1581 with a force the province had never faced and could not meaningfully imagine. More than 40,000 troops, samurai, ashigaru, and the machinery that followed armies, entered from 6 directions at once. The scale was not only tactical, it was psychological. Wherever the defenders looked, they saw movement, lines of men, smoke, flags. Orders carried down valleys like echoes. It was meant to crush the mind before it crushed the body. This was not a campaign of maneuver and decisive engagement. It was devastation delivered by regular armies against a civilian population. The old distinction between combatant and non-combatant, never clean in feudal warfare but still understood in theory, was discarded openly. In Iga, everyone was treated as a potential carrier of ninja knowledge, and in that logic, everyone became a target. The first villages fell within hours. Small communities that might have sheltered a handful of operatives, people trained in infiltration, sabotage, assassination, had no answer to coordinated assault by disciplined troops arriving in numbers too large to confuse or delay. Those who stood to fight were cut down quickly. Those who fled into the forest discovered that escape routes were already being watched. Nobunaga's forces had guides from surrounding regions, men who knew the mountains well enough to anticipate the obvious trails and cut off the desperate ones. The burnings began early, and they did not stop. Villages were set ablaze in patterns meant to ensure total destruction. Not just roofs and walls, but food stores, tools, equipment, anything that could support survival or preserve knowledge. The goal was not occupation, it was erasure. In some valleys, the smoke thickened until daylight turned dull and colorless, and the sun became a pale stain behind ash. What followed had a logic as cold as it was brutal. Captured ninja, along with anyone suspected of being ninja, which in practice meant most adult males, were executed without delay. Women and children faced decisions that shifted from place to place. Some were killed, others scattered into distant regions where they had no ties and no protection, deliberately separated from families to break transmission of skill and identity. The elderly, who carried generations of accumulated technique and tradition, were not treated as harmless. They were treated as repositories. Their elimination was prioritized. Iga resisted anyway because it had no other choice. Families used what they had always used: terrain, prepared positions, traps, ambushes, guerrilla attacks that turned narrow paths into death. They inflicted casualties. They slowed advances. In isolated encounters, small groups leveraged experience and local knowledge to overwhelm larger conventional detachments. For moments at a time, the mountains still belonged to Iga. But skill does not defeat an enemy that refuses to fight on your terms. When an ambush killed 20 soldiers, Nobunaga's commanders sent 200 more. When traps made a valley dangerous, the army waited or went around or brought men whose only job was to crawl forward and die first so the rest could advance. When defenders hid in caves or sealed positions, invaders burned entrances, sealed exits, or starved them out. Every refuge was treated as temporary, every hiding place as a problem to be solved by patience and numbers. Local knowledge, once Iga's greatest advantage, became insufficient against a force that did not need tactical victory. It only needed persistence. The defenders knew secret paths, but every path ended somewhere, and those endpoints could be blocked. They knew which ridges were hard to climb, but the invading army was large enough to avoid barriers while maintaining pressure elsewhere. They knew how to move invisibly, but invisibility has no value when there is nowhere left to move to, when the entire province is under occupation, and every valley is watched. As the weeks dragged on, the networks began to collapse, not because people forgot their craft, but because the environment that made the craft possible was being destroyed. Communication between communities broke as armies occupied the corridors that connected them. Families that had coordinated for generations found themselves cut off, fighting separate, desperate battles without reinforcement, without warning, without the information that had once been their strength. And the very structure that made Iga ungovernable in peacetime, decentralized, distributed, resistant to domination, became a fatal weakness under systematic attack. There was no central command capable of coordinating defense at scale, no unified strategy, only scattered groups being isolated and eliminated in sequence. Some tried negotiation. Representatives were sent to Nobunaga's commanders, offering service in exchange for mercy, an attempt to trade skills for survival. They were executed as examples. The message was simple. There would be no incorporation, no compromise, no future in which these communities remained intact. Others tried to flee. Most were intercepted at the borders by forces positioned specifically to prevent escape. A few reached distant provinces, but arrived as refugees stripped of what made them formidable. No community, no network, no resources, no safe ground on which to rebuild. Even survival began to look like a different kind of defeat. The psychological destruction was as deliberate as the physical one. These were communities that had maintained autonomy for centuries, that had repelled earlier attempts at control, that had built identity around being difficult to conquer and impossible to hold. Now they were being crushed by an enemy that did not seek elegance or honor, only completion. Every technique that had worked against previous invaders failed against an army willing to ignore losses and keep advancing. The legendary infiltrators discovered that infiltration was useless when there was no single strategic target left to strike. You could kill an officer, and another stepped into place with the same orders. You could sabotage supply lines, and the army's mass absorbed disruption. You could gather intelligence, but intelligence becomes meaningless when the enemy strategy is simple and total. Occupy everything. Burn what feeds resistance, kill what sustains it, seal what escapes. Assassination, too, became irrelevant. The operation did not depend on a single leader's will. It was mechanical. It continued regardless of who commanded it, because the command had already been decided at a higher level, and the machinery had been built to execute it. By December 1581, organized resistance had effectively ended. Some families held out in remote mountain positions, starving and cut off, surrounded by men who could afford to wait. A few operatives remained at large, conducting sporadic attacks that killed soldiers, but changed nothing. The majority of the population was dead, dispersed, or captured, awaiting whatever decision the invaders made for them. The casualty estimates are uncertain. Records are incomplete and often contradictory. But credible accounts point to thousands killed in the initial invasion, and thousands more in the clearing operations that followed. A population that may have numbered 10 to 15,000 before the assault was reduced drastically, perhaps by 2/3, and the survivors were scattered so thoroughly they could not reconstitute their communities. The victory was complete, not because Nobunaga's forces were more skilled. By measures of individual capability, the defenders were often superior. The victory came from a different understanding, that superior skill becomes irrelevant when enough force is applied with patience and brutality. You don't need to be better than your opponent if you can afford to lose 100 men to kill 10, and keep doing it until the 10 are gone. Iga was erased as a place that could produce ninja, but Iga was only half the story. Because in Koga, the end would come without the same inferno, through a pattern quieter, slower, and in some ways more terrifying. Iga died in fire and noise. Koga would die in silence, one name at a time. Koga watched what happened to Iga and understood the message, but understanding offered no clear solution. The families of Koga faced a strategic impossibility. They could not defeat state power in open conflict, yet they could not remain autonomous without inviting the same kind of extermination their neighbors had suffered. And Koga was not Iga. Where Iga had maintained relative unity through councils and collective decision-making, Koga was already fracturing before the state's attention fully settled on it. The province had never been as cohesive. It was a patchwork of semi-independent family networks, cooperating when necessary, but guarding their own identities, their own interests, and sometimes their own grudges. Decentralization had once been a shield. Under systematic pressure, it became a weakness that could be exploited. The families were isolated by terrain and tradition. The Mochizuki held one valley, the Ugachi another, the Naiki a third. Contact existed, coordination happened, but they did not function as a single entity that could move as one body. When the state began tightening around them, each family faced its own calculation, and those calculations diverged in ways that would prove fatal. Some argued for resistance. They prepared positions, strengthened defenses, reached out to other communities, tried to imagine a unified front, but Iga had already shown the outcome. Open resistance meant annihilation, and the unification project did not end with Nobunaga. Under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, consolidation continued with the same willingness to apply overwhelming force against populations that refused submission. Other families pursued accommodation. They sent representatives to Hideyoshi's administration, offering intelligence services exclusively to the emerging state. They proposed becoming official agents, trading autonomy for continued existence, independence for protection. It was an attempt to survive by folding into the new order rather than standing outside it. Hideyoshi's response was strategically brilliant and morally devastating. He accepted some offers, rejected others, and used the divisions this created to shatter Koga beyond reconstitution. Families brought into state service found themselves employed against families that held back. Former allies were set against one another, and the state managed the resulting conflicts with calm precision, ensuring that no unified ninja power could ever re-emerge. Co-optation was not a contract. It was absorption. Families that agreed to serve were not simply hired. They were broken apart and redistributed. Members were dispersed to different regions, preventing them from maintaining local networks. Techniques were documented by administrators, stripping the families of the secrecy that had been the foundation of their power. Children were educated under state systems, learning loyalty to the emerging order instead of loyalty to family tradition. And for those who might have unified resistance, there was another method: selective elimination. Not the mass killing of Iga, no fields of bodies, no smoke columns that demanded memory. This was quieter. Key individuals disappeared. An elder known for strategic thinking died in what looked like an accident. A family head advocating resistance was killed by operatives from a rival family now serving the state. A younger figure with the charisma to unite disparate groups simply vanished. No official explanation, no trial, no public consequences. These killings were not improvised. They were conducted using ninja methods against ninja targets. Infiltration, poison, staged accidents. The state had learned something from Iga. Brute force was expensive, disruptive, and loud enough to create martyrs. It was more efficient to hollow a community out from the inside, turning its own capabilities into tools of dissolution. Former ninja in state employment became the primary weapon against independent ninja who refused incorporation. The result was a collapse without a battle. There was no invasion of Koga comparable to the Iga campaign, no sweeping burn of villages, no mass executions that forced themselves into chronicles. Instead, the communities fragmented, families scattered, networks dissolved. It happened step by step, slowly enough that each compromise felt survivable, until survival had become something else entirely. Some families tried to preserve identity within state service, keeping techniques and hoping to pass them to the next generation. But what remained was form without substance. Skills survived, intelligence gathering, covert movement, infiltration, but severed from the social world that had given them meaning. A ninja acting as a state agent was not living the same tradition as an autonomous community member, even if the physical methods looked identical. The younger generation faced choices that were not really choices. They could cling to tradition and risk elimination, or they could integrate and abandon an identity that no longer had a place to stand. Most chose integration, not as betrayal, but as pragmatism. What value was there in autonomy when autonomy was no longer possible? What point was there in preserving a name that would get you killed? The deeper loss was not counted in bodies. A community can survive casualties if it keeps its structure and shared purpose. But when the purpose disappears, when ninja shifts from an autonomous identity to a state job, when villages that sustained the culture are dispersed, when the next generation learns techniques without the context that gave them weight, The culture dies, even if individuals remain alive. By the early 1590s, Koga, as an autonomous ninja region, had effectively ceased to exist. Some families still lived in the area, but now as subjects like any other. Some individuals still possessed covert capabilities, but used them as state agents, or not at all. The networks that connected communities, shared information, and enabled collective action had been dismantled with administrative patience and quiet violence. The death was nearly invisible, unlike Iga, whose destruction was loud enough to leave scars in memory. Koga dissolved through absorption, forced migration, selective elimination, and generational assimilation. There were no major battles to record, no dramatic last stands to remember, no single moment where the end could be pointed to, which made the end more complete. Iga's annihilation created stories, resistance, martyrdom, a clear narrative of overwhelming force. Koga simply faded, its families scattered, its traditions absorbed or abandoned, its history reduced to administrative residue in a state that had no reason to preserve what it had eliminated. A few remained independent, operating alone, dwindling with each generation as the world tightened, and young people chose survival over defiance. They preserved knowledge with no community to anchor it, maintained techniques with no structure to transmit them through, remembered a tradition that the new Japan had made irrelevant. What died in Iga and Kōga was not only villages and bloodlines. It was a form of power the emerging state could not tolerate, autonomous, decentralized, invisible, and ungovernable. And once that kind of power was removed, Japan itself became something new, organized, monitored, centralized. The shadows did not vanish. They were claimed. Those mountains was an entire model of power, one that had existed in Japan for centuries and one that could not survive inside the centralized state being built in its place. Regional autonomy died first. For generations, Japan had been a patchwork of semi-independent territories where central authority was weak, contested, or absent. Mountain provinces like Iga and Kōga, coastal communities that controlled their own trade, religious institutions with armed forces, merchant guilds with political influence of their own. These were power centers that did not sit neatly inside feudal hierarchy. They existed beside it, beneath it, and sometimes against it. The destruction of the ninja heartlands signaled that this era was ending. The emerging state would tolerate no autonomous regions, no populations that governed themselves, no territory where central authority could not reach. This was not only about ninja, it was about a principle. Every part of Japan would be administered, every population would be subject, every form of organized power would operate under state control, or it would be removed. Iga and Kōga were targeted first because they were the most obviously ungovernable, but the logic did not stop with them. It could not stop with them. Centralization is not satisfied by exceptions. Decentralized warfare died with them. The ninja model of combat, small groups operating independently, making local decisions, using techniques transmitted through families rather than institutions, was incompatible with the standardized forces the state was building. The new armies needed doctrine that could be taught, regulated, repeated. Units needed to follow formations, use controlled equipment, operate under clear chains of command. That made them predictable, manageable, and ultimately governable by the state that organized and funded them. But governable warfare requires eliminating forms of combat that depend on individual initiative, intimate terrain knowledge, and decentralized decision-making. That was exactly what the ninja represented. Knowledge outside state control became intolerable. Ninja power came from specialized knowledge, infiltration methods, poison formulas, intelligence-gathering practices, assassination skills, transmitted through households and communities rather than official institutions. That monopoly created leverage no castle could fully negate. It meant there were capabilities in Japan that did not originate from the state and therefore could not be fully supervised by it. The state's response was not to destroy the value of that knowledge, but to seize its ownership. Techniques were documented by administrators, studied by emerging security structures, and absorbed into official operations. But absorption required destruction. As long as the originating communities remained intact, they could continue generating expertise beyond oversight, adapting, refining, training new operatives who answered to family obligation rather than government command. So the communities had to be broken. And once that precedent was set, the implications reached beyond ninja. It established that valuable information and capability could not remain privately held. The state asserted not only political control, but epistemological control, the authority to determine what knowledge could exist, who could possess it, and how it could be transmitted. Invisible power died in those mountains. The ninja embodied authority without visibility. They had no castles to project dominance, no armies to intimidate, no official titles to legitimize influence, yet they could shape outcomes, alter political calculations, and constrain what even powerful lords could safely do. It was influence without institution, power that could not be paraded, only feared. A centralizing state could not tolerate that. Its authority depended on visible proof, armies in formation, fortifications on hills, ceremonies of submission. Those displays mattered because they taught populations where power lived. But if power could operate invisibly, if outcomes could be shaped by unseen hands, then the state's visible dominance could be revealed as incomplete, even hollow. The state claimed to be the strongest actor in its territory. How could that claim be secured if power itself could exist outside sight? The figure of the independent ninja became impossible. A man who served no lord permanently, who chose contracts, who maintained autonomy while temporarily employed. This was no longer a socially or legally acceptable role. In the emerging order, covert operations could exist only as state function or criminal act. If you practiced these skills outside government authority, you were not an irregular specialist, you were a threat. That shift did more than eliminate a profession, it erased an entire category of identity. Japan had always contained people who existed outside the main status divisions of samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant, wandering monks, mountain ascetics, traveling entertainers, marginal groups living in the seams of society. The centralization project demanded that those seams be stitched shut. The ninja were simply the most dangerous example, and therefore the first to be destroyed. The illusion of freedom died with them. Japan had never been free in any modern sense. Hierarchy constrained everyone. Mobility was limited. Power belonged to narrow elites. But within that structure, there had been spaces where autonomy could still breathe. Valleys rarely reached by authority, trade routes that slipped across boundaries, religious communities that resisted secular control. The destruction of the ninja provinces showed those spaces were being eliminated. The state was extending into every valley, monitoring every route, bringing every institution under administrative oversight. There would be no autonomous pockets left. No communities beyond the grasp of central authority. No alternative ways of organizing life that could endure without permission. Shadow warfare as an independent practice ceased to exist. Covert operations did not end. They expanded. The difference was ownership. They would be conducted by government agents following policy, not by autonomous communities serving multiple clients or pursuing their own interests. The techniques survived. The social context that produced them did not. And the fear that ninja had once generated among rulers did not disappear. It was captured. Before, every lord lived with the knowledge that covert networks might target him, spy on him, or serve his rivals. That created a kind of distributed deterrence. Even powerful men had to consider retaliation from unseen hands. After the destruction of the independent communities, that fear became a tool of state power. Only the government controlled the forces capable of infiltration, assassination, and deep intelligence. A monopoly on covert violence gave the new state leverage it had never possessed before. So what died in Iga and Kōga was not only people and villages. It was the possibility of power existing outside the state, autonomous, decentralized, invisible, and ungovernable. And once that possibility was destroyed, Japan's future narrowed into a single shape: order imposed from above, maintained by systems that could watch, record, and punish. The shadows did not leave. They became property. When the Tokugawa shogunate unified Japan in 1603, it inherited a country where independent ninja communities had already been destroyed or absorbed. What replaced them was not the end of covert warfare, but its transformation into something colder and more durable. Espionage as permanent state policy. The decentralization that had once protected Iga and Kōga was gone. In its place, intelligence became institutional, embedded in government structure, backed by law, and designed to outlast any one leader. The state did not simply learn from the ninja. It took what had been dangerous precisely because it was uncontrolled and made it official. The Metsuke system embodied that shift. These were inspectors with legal authority to investigate, monitor, and report directly to the shogun. They moved throughout Japan, gathering information, measuring loyalty, identifying threats before they could harden into rebellion. Their methods echoed what ninja networks had long practiced: covert observation, informant cultivation, pressure applied quietly. But now those methods carried legitimacy. They were not outsiders working in the gaps. They were the gaps, owned and managed. The Oniwaban pushed further into the realm the state refused to name. Operating as the shogun's private intelligence service, they conducted work that was never officially acknowledged. Infiltration, suppression of dissent, the collection of sensitive information. The same capabilities that independent ninja had offered now existed under direct government control. The techniques survived. The independents did not. The shadows were not eliminated. They were centralized. Surveillance became permanent and then comprehensive. The Sankin Kotai system required daimyo to maintain residences in both their home provinces and Edo, with families remaining in the capital as hostages. It was not only a political arrangement, it was a mechanism that forced constant exposure. Movement tracked, finances strained, intentions constrained by the knowledge that loved ones could be used as leverage. Loyalty was not assumed, it was monitored. At the level of common life, the Goningumi system organized people into groups of 5 households with collective responsibility for each member's behavior. In practice, it turned communities into surveillance cells. Neighbors watched neighbors because punishment could spread. Fear did what proclamations could not. It made self-policing routine. This degree of control would have been far harder to achieve while independent intelligence networks still existed. In the Sengoku world, a lord who wanted to rebel could hire covert specialists, communicate through unmonitored channels, coordinate through secrecy enforced by custom and compartmentalization. After Iga and Kōga were erased, secrecy itself became a state monopoly. Rebellion did not become morally unthinkable. It became logistically impractical. You could not organize in the dark when the government owned the dark. And while the people who had practiced covert warfare were disappearing from reality, they were multiplying in story. Within decades, tales of ninja spread rapidly. Supernatural abilities, impossible feats, mystical powers. The mythologization was so complete that by the mid-17th century, many people understood ninja not through memory, but through theater and popular tales. The historical truth, villages burned, families scattered, communities erased, receded into the background. This transformation served the state perfectly. Folklore is harmless when it turns power into entertainment. The mythical ninja became exotic and distant, detached from politics, detached from the question that mattered. What happens when a community refuses central control? Theater and literature portrayed ninja as rogues, mysterious assassins, tragic heroes, individual figures with personal drama. They did not portray them as populations eliminated for autonomy. They did not portray them as a warning written into the countryside with fire. The myth replaced the reality so thoroughly that the real history became almost invisible. And the myth had another effect. It made actual intelligence work harder to see. If people expected the supernatural, then the real machinery of surveillance, patient observation, quiet informants, routine documentation, felt too ordinary to be threatening. The spectacular story taught the population to look for the wrong signs. Meanwhile, the state's agents could operate with greater efficiency precisely because their methods looked like nothing at all. This was the architecture behind Tokugawa peace. The shogunate achieved 2.5 centuries of internal stability, not through military dominance alone, but through information control. The government knew what was happening in domains before it became crisis. It monitored potential threats. It applied pressure early, quietly, and decisively. Peace was not the absence of violence, it was the presence of a system capable of detecting dissent before it could become organized resistance. The fear that ninja had once generated among the ruling class, unpredictable, distributed, impossible to fully control, did not disappear. It was captured and redirected. Only the state controlled infiltration, assassination, and deep intelligence. What had once haunted every lord as a private danger became a public instrument of authority. Uniformity followed. The autonomous provinces, independent communities, and self-governing pockets that had characterized feudal Japan were absorbed into standardized structures. Regions followed the same laws, paid taxes through regulated systems, answered to centralized oversight. Diversity created by fragmentation was replaced by a uniform order that made governance easier and dissent harder. Over time, the victory became conceptual as well as physical. Generations grew up knowing only centralized authority, standardized systems, permanent surveillance. The idea that intelligence capabilities could exist outside state control, that power could be organized without hierarchy, that communities could endure beyond administration. These became remote concepts, disconnected from lived experience. Alternatives did not merely weaken, they became difficult to imagine. The ninja had once inhabited darkness as a space no one could fully own. The state did not illuminate that space, it claimed it. It monopolized covert operations rather than making them visible. Infiltration, assassination, intelligence gathering, all continued, but only as government practice. The shadows remained. They simply stopped belonging to anyone else. The final irony was unavoidable. The most effective techniques the ninja had cultivated, invisibility, infiltration, information control, would be used most successfully by the state that destroyed them. The communities that perfected covert warfare were eliminated by a government that then deployed those same methods at a scale decentralized networks could never match. By the mid-17th century, the transformation was complete. Japan had unity, centralized authority, and comprehensive social control. Independent practitioners were gone. Their capabilities were absorbed. Their memory was rewritten into myth. And once myth takes hold, it doesn't just hide the truth. It makes the truth harder to recover because it teaches people to stop looking. The ninja did not vanish into legend by accident. Legend was safer than memory. And the state needed the world to remember the wrong story, because the real one ended with a simple principle. There is no place for power that cannot be owned. The ninja didn't lose a war. They lost the right to exist, because when a state demands total control, there is no place for invisible power. Were the ninja destroyed because they were violent or because they were uncontrollable? Comment below.